My name is Jessie Jones. I'm a Dublin-based artist, and my work explores stories of women who have been omissed from history and bringing them back into the frame through filmmaking and installation practices and sculpture and live activation.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the next in our series of Unexpected Views. This evening I'm joined by Jessie Jones, and we are going to be talking about Jessie's practice, but also this painting by Savoldo. Jessie Jones has established herself as a formidable presence in the contemporary art world. Her unique approach to expanded cinema explores magical counter-narratives and suppressed archetypes through immersive film installations. Her exhibitions have spanned the globe with solo shows at prestigious venues such as the Talbot Rice Gallery in Edinburgh, the Samstag Museum of Art in Adelaide, and the Guggenheim Bilbao. She's featured in numerous group exhibitions from the Tokyo Art Fair to the Istanbul Biennale, consistently pushing the boundaries of her medium. Jessie is not only an accomplished artist, but also a dedicated educator, teaching on Sherkin Island in West Cork for TU Dublin. Her influence extends beyond her own practice, inspiring and nurturing the next generation of artists. Her most recent exhibition, Mirror Martyr Mirror Moon, was commissioned by Ikon in Birmingham as part of the National Gallery's National Treasures programme. Jessie developed a show around the loan of our self-portrait of St Catherine of Alexandria by Artemisia Gentileschi. And it actually feels quite strange to be having a conversation with Jessie about a different painting, because we've spent so long talking about that recently. But we will touch on that show as we go on. It's been a real privilege to work with Jessie on that project, and I'm very excited to see where our conversation leads us this evening. You should all have a mirror, I hope. If you haven't, Priyesh can supply you with one. But I think we should begin probably by talking about this wonderful painting.
Yeah.
Jessie, why did you want to talk about Savoldo tonight?
I've always really been drawn to this painting, and it strikes me as such a modern image. It really, when I first looked at it, I was like, I think I have one of those cloaks I wore to a music festival a few years ago. But it's that kind of sense of something that I couldn't believe I'd never seen before, Mary Magdalene wearing a silver cloak. And I'm a big film fan, and I love cinema. And for me, when I first seen it, I felt she was draped in like the silver screen. And it immediately made me think about things like Laura Mulvey and Lacan and the idea of cinema as a kind of mirror. But also what is the gaze, and what is the apparatus of the gaze. And I suppose whenever you look at a film, you get that feeling. I also am quite drawn to mirrors in my art. Obviously the recent project that I made with Ikon Gallery is called Mirror Martyr Mirror Moon. And for a long time I worked with mirrors, and I suppose there's some kind of connection between mirror self-identity and also a feeling of power and maybe violence with the mirror. In terms of film, I was really drawn to how this could be a kind of proto-cinematic image. I'm very interested in how there's kind of moments of cinema before the apparatus of the camera is developed. And if we think about the camera, it's basically a device that's made of mirrors. It's made of like refracted light and mirrors. So there's something in the art historical image that kind of predicts the future of cinema in the image. I was thinking about what Lacan says about how every mirror is, or every screen is a mirror, but actually perhaps every mirror is also a screen. So there's something about that, moving between the reflected image and the body. And I suppose the way she's draped, the way she's kind of concealing herself. I don't know if anybody's seen that new fashion label by MIA, the Omni, but it's like this kind of draped kind of fabric that allows us to resist AI recognition. So there's something about a really modern subject of Mary Magdalene in this, and I've been working with the subject of Mary Magdalene for a few years now, and this was one of the most kind of exciting and modern looking Mary Magdalenes that I had seen.
Yeah, and this is a painting from the 16th century, and so it's almost a strange thing to look at this and to immediately want to talk about cinema. How has the relationship between typical classical paintings like this and your practice developed? What is the relationship for what you do and paint?
See, I kind of think that this developed a few years ago by accident. And I had been asked to make a show with an amazing gallery in Dublin called the Hugh Lane, which I know the National Gallery have a long-standing relationship with. And they asked me to make a work, and I kind of thought, you know, I'm trying to find a story here and a relationship in an inn. So I asked the curator to bring me through the gallery and bring me on a tour, but only stop me in front of artworks that were made by women. And it's quite a big gallery if anybody's been there in Dublin, and we stopped twice in about like an hour of walking through the gallery. So I thought, you know, there's a story here, there's something very compelling about this very serious omission of a municipal gallery to only have 2 works made by women out of hundreds of artworks, you know. So I made a project called No More Fun and Games, a feminist parasite institution. And one of the walls of the gallery, I felt that I wanted to incorporate the viewer into the experience of looking at the paintings. So I made this space that was completely mirrored, reflective walls, and we had a beautiful Agnes Martin hanging on the mirrored wall, and we had some incredible Isabel Gloag, an early 20th century Scottish painter, also that was restored and hung on the wall. So that feeling of working with historical paintings, and for me as well as an artist, I feel like that you're always working in this kind of seance way with art history. There's a kind of spirit in art that kind of comes through you, and I think that artists are very moved by other artists' work, whether they're contemporary or historical. You're very affected and moved to think about art when you look at art, you know?
Yeah. And I think one of the things that really permeates through your practice as well is that disruption of the things that we expect to see and the way that we expect to look. And I think one of the reasons that we picked this Mary Magdalene as opposed to any other is because it also does that. It's not an obvious Mary Magdalene. It's very typically Brescian of its time, but it's not like any of the other Magdalenes that we have in the gallery. And that disrupted gaze, I think, has also been really important.
Yeah, I think when I came in to see it as well, it really reminded me very suddenly of a Milton Green photograph of Marilyn Monroe from 1954 that people wouldn't, if you've seen it, you would really recognize it. And just the pose and the way she's looking at the camera, it all feels so kind of modern. It feels like it's of the now. There's some kind of sense of knowing in relationship to what the gaze actually means. It's not a pictorial representation of a body. It feels like a living body rather than a kind of representation of a body, which I think is very rare and important when we see women represented in art, that we get, by some weird slippage of possibility, we get this possible Mary Magdalene that isn't just an apparition, but is in a way looking at you, you know? It's like she's looking at you as well as you looking at her. Does anybody feel that?
Yeah, and one of the, I think the interesting things, part of the reason that we hope that you would bring or enjoy these mirrors this evening is to talk about this connection as well between representation and reflection, and the role of how the self is represented, how men are representing women, how women represent themselves. Yeah. And so, do you want to talk about our mirrors?
I suppose one of the things that happened was when I was working on the Gentileschi project for the last year, which was an incredible privilege, and the National Gallery were so supportive and helpful to my artistic research. I remember Siobhan bringing me round to see every single Mary Magdalene and St Catherine in the gallery that we could find, and it was very exciting. You know, that's what floats my boat anyway. So. That feeling of like looking and spending time with Gentileschi, and I had the painting printed out in my studio, and it was on the studio wall for months, and just it was one of them days where the penny just dropped, And I was looking at the painting of Gentileschi, the self-portrait as St Catherine, and I realised that for her to make that painting, she would have had to really, really look at herself in the mirror. And I felt like that was the activation, that was the performative activation of like taking a sense of control and autonomy over your image as a woman artist in this period of time where, you know, there wasn't so many women artists. I mean, she's one of the most significant women artists of this period. So that sense of like taking your own image into your own hands. And then I came to the gallery and I just did this really playful thing, and this is why I have the mirror in front, and this is just something I'd like you to kind of test out yourself. It's a really nice way of thinking about how we look at artworks, and one of the things I like to do is use the mirror. You kind of have to have your back to the artwork. So find a painting anywhere in the gallery. Find it and capture it in your mirror. It can be a painting or it can be a reflection of somebody else in the room. But what it's nice to do is once you find it, you can kind of move it around and you can put it beside other paintings. So the first time I did this little trick, you can bring a mirror to the National Gallery anytime and do this trick, and people will think they won't think you're strange at all. But I remember I was walking around the room where Gentileschi was before she was loaned out to the Ikon, and I was in the room like this for ages because this mirror is very small. So, and I didn't have such a steady hand that day. So I have a great reflection right now of this painting landing right over here on top of this crowd. And then when you move it quickly, you can juxtapose it with other paintings. It's really fun. It's like live Photoshop in your own hands. But it was really fun to get the image of Gentileschi captured in my hand mirror and superimpose it over a ratio. To erase a ratio by just like finding Artemisia on top of him for a moment. It was really fun. So that's just a nice little technique for people to try out again when you come into the gallery, and it's a nice way to move through the gallery as well and to bring yourself and your body in movement in relationship to the paintings in a different way.
And I hope that we're going to see lots of you wandering around the gallery with mirrors for the rest of this evening. For those people who haven't been to see Mirror Martyr Mirror Moon, can you talk us through how that came to be? Describe that experience for people, because it is an experience. You walk into that gallery space, and it's not just seeing a St Catherine on tour. It's an experience.
Yeah, I wanted it to be a ritual, and working with Artemisia was a very kind of mystical and powerful experience. Melanie Pocock invited me to respond to the Artemisia Gentileschi, which was kind of daunting, but once it got in motion, I was absolutely brought into her world and was so captivated by her life and writings about her, and also got to know some of her friends like Francesca Caccini, an amazing 17th century composer who writes the first ever opera that's staged outside of Italy. And kind of bringing those stories together, I made a 16mm film of 3 figures. The self-portrait of St Catherine by Gentileschi gives us St Catherine. It gives us Gentileschi. But when you look into who was St Catherine, it was actually Hypatia of Alexandria, who I've been obsessed with for years and didn't realize that she was in the DNA of St Catherine. So that was really magical to find out that that was in the DNA. And in terms of a mirror image, Hypatia of Alexandria was she kind of marks the end of the world of antiquities, the ancient world. She is ostracized by a Christian mob because they don't agree with her hypothesis on when Easter should fall. Obviously, she's a pagan. She thinks Easter should be around the cosmology of Ishtar and the cosmos, not the Gregorian emergent calendar. So they tear her to pieces in the streets of Alexandria using oyster shells And that's where we get the phrase ostracization also. But it's also, it marks one of the first ever really violent executions of a woman for public speak and for publicly speaking, for her intellect, for her philosophy, for her politics. She's publicly ostracized in a very violent way. So just kind of thinking about how St Catherine then becomes, at the same time, she emerges as a saint who is a Christian saint, who is murdered by a pagan mob. And it's just that sense of, you know, that mirror image of martyrdom as a political subjectivity. And I think that was just a very compelling thing to make a triple-headed goddess. So you have Gentileschi, Hypatia, and St Catherine, and all these women make work and have public lives at various different moments in time, but all their lives kind of circulate around a type of violence against women. So I wanted the show to feel like a very sacred, almost kind of cleansing, healing ritual, where you would spend time with the Gentileschi painting, but you would feel the vibration and the kind of resonance of the stories of women in this way. And I think that's why I've always been attracted to the figure of Mary Magdalene, because she isn't just one person, she's a composite of many. And in my work I often think about this kind of what I call sedimentation feminism, which is thinking about how there's lots of different kind of genealogies and DNAs that go into the archetypes and stories that we as women share and have as a shared history of experience.
Yeah, and I think so when you walk into the show, you're kind of immersed in darkness, and you can see the Artemisia St Catherine looking back at you, and you can hear the incredible musical composition that goes across the film, and you can also see a self-portrait. And so this whole experience of being part of this broader story, and as Jessie said, one of the first conversations we had was for hours about Mary Magdalene, because it's something that is a very interesting subject to both of us. But we also enjoyed the juxtaposition that down at the bottom here, as well as our Savoldo Magdalene at the top. We've got Parmigianino's rendering of the mystic marriage of St Catherine. So that's St Catherine with her wheel at the side there. And she didn't want to marry anyone, she wanted to remain faithful to Christ. And you can see the infant Christ giving her a ring there. And you've got that doorway at the background, which also looks like a mirror. So if that's the painting that you chose for your mirror, then you can get yourself into a hall of mirrors. But the echoes of those stories that work through time, I think, are so important. And you know, we've talked a little bit about the painting. We should probably talk a little bit more about the painting, seeing as we've brought people to sit in front of it. So this is a really unusual depiction of Mary Magdalene, but we can recognize it as a Mary Magdalene because of a few little telltale signs. So we can see her ointment jar, so she goes to anoint the body of Christ. We can just about, if you look in the bottom corner, see a red hem, that more familiar red dress that we'd expect. And you have to almost look past her in order to fit this traditional narrative. But the Magdalene has also been a theme across some of your other shows as well.
Yeah. I suppose I made a work, that's how we kind of first started speaking, was I made a work a few years ago called The Tower, and it was about Mary Magdalene. And it began with a kind of show in Dublin that looked at the legacy of the archetype of the Magdalene and what it means in contemporary Ireland. And many of you might know that Ireland had very regressive institutions called Magdalene laundries that were open and operating up until the 90s in Ireland. And we had a very strong incarceratory regime around women who were considered fallen women, and it was very, very brutal. So I was very interested in thinking about what are other stories around the Magdalenes that we don't hear, you know? So I started researching Magdalene laundries in other places and realised that actually in Glasgow they had a Magdalene laundry called Mary Hill Magdalene, and it had one of the most incredible stories where a group of teenagers that were incarcerated in the Magdalene laundry in the 1950s, they broke out of the Magdalene laundry. It's one of the only breakout of the Magdalene iterations that actually happened. And when they broke out the Magdalene laundry, they were all young teenage girls. They took over this kind of house. It was covered in all the tabloid newspapers in Glasgow at the time. They took over this house and they built a fire, and they planned to like live together as a community of survivors. But within 2 days, they were found again by a local farmer and a priest, and they were taken back to the Magdalene laundry. So they broke out again, but this time they dispersed and they went incognito, and they just lived the rest of their lives without being able to speak about that. So there's something in that kind of shared history of a Magdalene kind of DNA that's in many women's experiences, whether you're Irish or whether you've had a kind of intergenerational relationship to the Magdalene laundries. One of the other interesting thing about the connection between mirrors and Magdalene laundries, and this actually was something that I found out through a historian of material culture, Lisa Godson. She was researching for a project I did in London a few years ago with Art Angel, myself and another artist, Sarah Brown. We were researching the Contagious Diseases Acts, which, if anybody knows about the Contagious Diseases Acts, I'm sure some of you do. They were set up in the UK and in the colonies, like Ireland, and Singapore was one of the places where it was enacted. It was a penal code type law that meant that women in any of these port cities in the colonies could be stopped and searched by policemen, and they used gynecological mirrors to very violently strip search women right up until the 1860s, into the 1870s. But it's actually the beginning of the reformist movement that sparks off what we think of as reformist feminism. And again, that begins with this sense of a mirror. So this sense of the mirror being that this kind of intersection of violence is something that is very particular, and how thinking about Mary Magdalene just always, and I know that you're so passionate about Mary Magdalene, but it's like some kind of DNA of feminism. You know, I feel like there's something about Mary Magdalene. It's redemptive, it's horrific, it's violent, it can be, you know, humorous, it can bring a lot of solidarity, but I think there's a feeling of taking back a sense of power and taking back a sense of autonomy and sexuality and freedom from playing with the figure of the Magdalene, not having it play with us, not having the Mary Magdalene subjectivity put upon us, but kind of taking that back and doing something else with it. One of my favourite Marys is Mary of Egypt, who lived in the desert and carried around loaves of bread forever. They never ran out. And she had no clothes, and her body was completely turned into a crisp. She was like a Dorito from being in the sun all the time. But she was a very interesting Mary.
Yeah. And so these stories of Mary of Egypt, the Mary Magdalene, and then the echoes and I suppose the sort of the harmonies they have across history really, I think, coalesce in the work that you produce. So you can probably tell that Jessie's practice is really research driven, that so much goes into it. So how do you turn that kind of story, the story of a character from the Bible and a figure from Christian history, and then also a group of teenagers in Glasgow, into how does that become the project? How does that become the show?
That's a great question, and to be honest with you, there's two kind of ways I think about it. One of the smartest things that somebody ever said to me was a curator once said to me, I had described to them the history of the Contagious Diseases Acts, and I had gone through this really detailed, nuanced thing about penal codes for about 3 hours, and they said, that's amazing, how are you going to let go and make an artwork? And it was just a eureka moment of like, that was such a smart thing to say. And it made me realize that actually I am a nerd. I'm very promiscuous with research. Okay? I'm very, very voracious and promiscuous. I will look at one thing and then find another thing tangentially that I feel belongs with it. But being able to let go and know that something else is happening with an artwork. And, that's the thing of like, I'm working within a craft for 2 decades now as an artist. So you get to a point where there's a flow and there's a sense of trust that beyond the research, there's a trust in aesthetics. There's a trust in affect and art, and especially in spending a lot of time in installations where you see how publics move, and the darkness in my work is very important to me. It's a bit of a health and safety nightmare, but dark spaces are really important to me in terms of how people navigate the world that it's such a privilege and an honor to be an artist. The most difficult thing that we can do in the world is create worlds. The worlding of the world is the most difficult thing to do, and the fact that there's this little moment that you can do as an artist, you can make a space where people enter, and whether they trust you or they don't trust you, they have an experience. So it's really an honor to get to do that. So that's how I just let go.
And that letting go and that trust has also really led to lots of interesting collaboration as well, with performers. How is that for you? How is it to take the world that you've built and then to invite someone else to inhabit it, I suppose?
Yeah, it's amazing. Collaborating is definitely letting go. It's letting go and trusting people, and kind of seeing, once you're in the room with the right people, they're gonna respond and do the right thing, and their instinct will be great, So from having experience of collaborating with the right people, it's such a privilege to kind of be around people that just surprise you. For example, the project that I made for the Gentileschi project, Mirror Martyr Mirror Moon, I collaborate with a lot of the same people over and over again, so there's that trust. But I worked with a performer for the first time, Stephanie Lampreia, and she's incredible, Glasgow-based avant-garde opera performer. She's just incredible, and it was just such an honor to work with her, and you just let go because you're like, wow. So yeah, just having an instinct about working with the right people.
Yeah. I'm conscious that we want to wrap up soon, so we want to make sure we've got time for questions. But I think we should also, maybe come back to this theme of Mary Magdalene, come back to this kind of significance that, and you touched upon it before when you were talking about the Magdalene laundries and this idea of the dissipation and these themes. And what is it, do you think, that inspires you to revisit these women's stories, these women who are hundreds, thousands of years away from us in time and space, that makes them so pressing and so pertinent that they're in your practice today?
I think it's because they're in your body. I feel like they're there with you. I suppose this is something that not a lot of people know apart from my really close friends. My mother is a very powerful psychic. So I grew up in a household with necromancy and chiromancy were just, over the kitchen table at breakfast. So there was always a sense of kind of layers of time and layers of spirit time. And I feel like, as an artist, you have this access to a kind of folded, crumpled piece of paper where different moments of aesthetic time and effectual time touch off each other. Artists are really inspired by other artists, so it doesn't feel as strange to an artist. I don't know, there's our artists here. Do people understand what I'm kind of referring to? As an artist, you feel like a time traveler because you're so connected in your body. I know Susan's a dancer, so she knows this for definite. You're so connected in your body when you look at an artwork, you're activated physically, but thinking about archetype and stories. And I think that we arrive in the world as a kind of compression of particles of other moments of time and other subjects that lived before us. There's that very famous, I work a lot with the histories of the European witch trials, and there's that very famous phrase, we are the great-granddaughters of the women you failed to murder, that you failed to kill, So that sense of lineage and legacy and political time. Political time doesn't just arrive, it arrives over centuries,
Amazing. We could go on for hours than we may yet do.
We're
But
leaving.
I think we should show our appreciation for Jessie sharing so much of her method and her practice with us, and then we'll give her a round of applause, and then we'll come to you for questions.